She knew what she was about to hear wasn't about battles, but about a dangerous idea. Hitler called himself a socialist, but not a Marxist. For him, socialism didn't mean economic equality, but the total obedience of a racially pure people to the state. A socialism forged in the ice of the North, in the myth of the Aryan community, and in the elimination of anything considered foreign to it. This video reveals how that vision was built and why almost no one talks about it. If you want to understand this forgotten layer of history, subscribe now. Our channel is close to hitting an important milestone, and your support is what allows us to keep delivering deep, undistorted analysis. She knew that the key to understanding this ideology lay in its very name. National Socialism was not just a political label, it was a calculated formula to capture the popular imagination. Hitler took a term that, in early 20th century Europe, was strongly linked to workers' struggles and economic redistribution, and stripped it of its Marxist content. In its place, he embedded radical nationalism, centered on the idea that the ideal community was defined by blood, not class. The word socialism was used to attract the discontented masses, but in his thinking it was merely a tool to strengthen the state and preserve Aryan purity. She realized that, for Hitler, this semantic manipulation was strategic. The term acted as a bridge, uniting dissatisfied workers, fervent nationalists, and war veterans under the same banner. At the same time, it kept at bay the ideological threat of Marxism, seen as too internationalist and egalitarian. This fusion, socialism in name, nationalism in content, allowed him to build a movement capable of speaking to different audiences while keeping firm control over the narrative and over Germany's political future. She recalls an afternoon in 1923 when Hitler granted an interview to American journalist George Sylvester Viereck, published in Liberty magazine. At that moment, he clearly explained how he viewed socialism and Marxism. Socialism is the science of dealing with the common good. Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. The Marxists have stolen and confused its meaning. I will take socialism away from the socialists. It was a definition that rejected any connection to class struggle or collective ownership. For him, socialism should serve the racial community, not economic equality. She understood that, in his reasoning, socialism had nothing to do with internationalism or social justice. Hitler claimed that his Germanic ancestors already lived in cohesive communities, maintaining certain lands in common and cultivating a spirit of internal solidarity. This historical narrative was used to assert that true socialism was patriotic and racial, designed to protect the nation rather than dissolve it into a global movement. At the same time, he made it clear that the state was the guardian of this order, and its role was to ensure the people's obedience and discipline. In the same interview, Hitler emphasized that he did not see himself as part of an international movement, but of an exclusively German project. By declaring, "We could have called ourselves the Liberal Party, but we chose to call ourselves National Socialists," he showed how the choice of name was both political and psychological. The goal was to fuse the rhetoric of social justice with that of national exclusivity, creating an emotional bond with the public. She knew this was a pivotal moment. Here, he was cementing the ideological foundation that would sustain the Third Reich. She saw that, for Hitler, Aryan socialism was not built solely on politics, but on a biological and climatic narrative. He claimed that the peoples of the North, shaped by long winters, harsh lands, and scarce resources, had developed an instinct for discipline, hard work, and internal cooperation to survive. In his view, these natural conditions shaped not only the body, but also the character, creating a moral superiority that would justify this people's leadership over others. She understood that, to him, this principle of work was not learned, but inherited. It was not the result of education or political ideology, but a trait inscribed in the blood. Hitler described that only strong races could thrive under such conditions, while weaker races would degenerate. This belief led him to argue that socialism should protect and expand these natural qualities, eliminating any influence or group that might corrupt this heritage. He believed that true progress did not lie in abolishing economic differences, but in aligning each individual with a collective goal: the strengthening of the racial community. Work, in this logic, was not merely production. It was a moral duty, a daily ritual that reaffirmed each member's belonging and usefulness to the nation. She realized that, in this construction, the individual ceased to exist as an end in itself. His value was measured by his capacity to serve the community of blood. She understood that, for Hitler, Aryan Socialism was not a flexible economic model open to all. It was a selective system, designed to serve exclusively the community he defined as racially pure. In his view, virtues like discipline, loyalty, courage, and a spirit of sacrifice were not products of culture or education, but a genetic inheritance passed down through generations. He believed these qualities were inscribed in Aryan blood, and that it was the state's duty to preserve them at any cost. She realized that, in this system, socialism did not mean integration, but exclusion. The idea of the common good was restricted to the ethnic group he deemed legitimate. Anyone outside that circle was seen as a potential threat, not only politically, but biologically. For this reason, social policies and support programs were not aimed at universalizing rights, but at strengthening the racial core, ensuring that resources, opportunities, and protection were concentrated on those worthy of belonging. In his thinking, this was the essence of Aryan socialism, an internal pact of absolute solidarity among members of the race, sustained by constant vigilance against any element that might weaken cohesion. It was not a utopia of equality, but a project for the maintenance and expansion of racial power. The state became the guardian of this purity, acting not only as a political administrator, but as the nation's biological curator. She realized that, for Hitler, Aryan socialism was above all a tool of social engineering. He did not see it as a system to balance wealth or reduce inequalities, but as a mechanism to shape society according to a predefined racial ideal. At the core of this vision was the belief that the nation should be a living organism, homogeneous, where every cell, every individual, fulfilled a specific function for the health of the collective body. From a psychological perspective, Hitler projected absolute order onto this model. There was no room for multiple identities, parallel cultures, or individual autonomy outside the state's logic. Cultural homogeneity was not a side effect, but a deliberate goal. Traditions, customs, and national symbols were elevated to an almost sacred status, reinforcing the daily sense of belonging and duty to the community. In his view, this symbolic repetition served to condition thought and eliminate any trace of dissent. Socially, Aryan socialism functioned as a closed contract. In exchange for loyalty and conformity, the individual received protection, work, and recognition, but always subordinated to racial interest. Culturally, the regime shaped the public sphere, from art to education, to exalt the Aryan myth and erase references considered degenerate. For Hitler, this was the only way to ensure that purity was not only biological, but also cultural and spiritual. She understood that this fusion of politics, culture, and biology created a system where disagreement was not just a betrayal of the state. It was a betrayal of the race itself. She saw that, for Hitler, Aryan socialism was also an ideological weapon against two seemingly opposite enemies, which he regarded as equally harmful: Marxism and liberal capitalism. Psychologically, this created a clear axis of internal and external enemies, reinforcing a sense of siege and urgency among his followers. Marxism, in his view, was too internationalist, dissolving national identity and promoting equality that, in his eyes, destroyed the natural hierarchy between peoples. Liberal capitalism, on the other hand, fostered individualism, excessive competition, and social fragmentation, eroding the cohesion of the racial community. Socially, this stance allowed Aryan socialism to present itself as a third way, aligned with neither Marxist left nor liberal right. This narrative attracted discontented sectors from both sides: workers distrustful of communism and nationalist businessmen who feared the instability of international capitalism. Culturally, it fueled a distinct political identity, isolating Germany from external ideological influences and creating the illusion of moral and economic self-sufficiency. She understood that this dual war was not mere rhetoric. It translated into concrete actions: systematic persecution of communists and Marxist socialists, censorship and dissolution of independent unions, while imposing strict control over large corporations, forcing them to serve the state's objectives. In Hitler's mind, only by eliminating both models simultaneously could he consolidate a racially pure socialism, where the economy was subordinated to politics and politics to the racial ideal. She saw that Aryan socialism promised a Germany united like a perfect village, where every man, woman, and child had a defined role and a clear sense of belonging. In propaganda images, farmers harvested wheat, soldiers marched with pride, children smiled in spotless uniforms. It was the portrait of social harmony without conflict, differences, or divisions. But behind this facade lay a ruthless logic. Any dissenting voice, any foreign cultural trace, was eliminated before it could threaten the carefully constructed balance. Psychologically, Hitler used this myth as an emotional anchor. He knew that humans seek community and purpose, and he exploited this need to shape mindsets. The individual felt part of something greater, yet lived under constant surveillance. The pressure to conform was invisible but suffocating. It was not necessary for everyone to love the regime. It was enough that everyone acted as if they did. This created a cycle of silent control, where even divergent thought was seen as a risk to the group's survival. Socially and culturally, this harmony meant total uniformity. National festivals replaced local traditions, public aesthetics were controlled to reflect purity, and cultural production served exclusively the regime's narrative. The promise of unity hid the reality of a system that traded diversity for stability, freedom for security, and demanded loyalty not only to the state, but to the racial myth sustaining it. She understood that this was the peak seduction of Aryan socialism, offering the illusion of perfection in exchange for total obedience. She saw that, in Aryan socialism, the feeling of belonging was not merely a byproduct of the regime, it was a carefully manufactured product. The state became an emotional engineer, shaping from the earliest age how each individual perceived their place in the world. In the Hitler Youth, children learned anthems and marches before they learned to read, absorbing the idea that their worth lay in serving the racial collective. In school, history was rewritten so that students felt pride not only in Germany but in their own lineage. This sense of belonging was fueled by rituals and symbols that gave daily life an appearance of grandeur and purpose. Parades, torchlight ceremonies, spotless uniforms, all designed to reinforce the notion that alone the individual was fragile. But within the Aryan community, they were part of something invincible. Singing the same anthem, wearing the same emblem, marching in the same rhythm created an emotional bond that replaced autonomy with collective loyalty. She understood that, at its core, the regime exploited a basic human need to be accepted and recognized. But in Aryan socialism, that acceptance came at a price. It was accompanied by the systematic exclusion of all who did not fit the standard. Belonging also meant accepting that others would be expelled, marginalized, or eliminated. The purity of the community was non-negotiable. It was maintained through constant vigilance and the willingness to sacrifice any element that threatened cohesion. In the end, belonging became not only a privilege, but a test of loyalty, renewed every day, in every public gesture, in every word spoken. She realized that, at the height of Aryan socialism, the sense of belonging ceased to be merely an emotional bond and became the key that unlocked and locked every door in social life. Those who belonged to the racial community had access to opportunities, protection, and recognition. Those who did not belong lived on the margins, under constant suspicion. This control was meticulous. The state decided where one could work, whom one could marry, what could be taught, and even which works of art could be seen. The entire economy was redesigned to serve this ideal. Private companies continued to exist, but functioned as cogs in a centralized machine, subordinated to political and racial objectives. Workers were integrated into party-controlled unions, not to negotiate better wages, but to reinforce discipline and productivity. Every factory, every farm, every school became an outpost of ideology, a space where belonging was measured by absolute alignment with the national project. Psychologically, total control had a double effect. For those who saw themselves as legitimate members of the community, it reinforced pride and loyalty. For those outside or on the margins of that definition, it instilled permanent fear and insecurity. She understood that this was the ultimate goal: to create a system where the rewards of belonging were as seductive as the punishments of exclusion were feared. In this way, Aryan socialism ceased to be a political concept and became a way of life, or of survival. She saw that even after military defeat and the fall of the regime, the psychological and cultural pillars of Aryan socialism did not vanish overnight. The narrative of belonging, purity, and collective destiny continued to echo, no longer as official policy, but as a memory nurtured by groups and individuals unwilling to abandon the myth. Books, symbols, and oral accounts kept alive the idea that there had once been a perfect community, disciplined and united under a higher purpose. Socially, the legacy was more subtle, but equally persistent. Elements of the regime's aesthetics and cultural organization, visual uniformity, mass rituals, identity-centered speeches, were adapted and absorbed by other movements, some far from Nazism, yet replicating the same logic of exclusion and enforced cohesion. She realized that this legacy seeped into politics, culture, and even debates about nationalism and sovereignty in later decades. Culturally, the memory of Aryan socialism survived as a myth blending nostalgia and propaganda. For some, it was remembered as an example of order and national strength. For others, as the ultimate symbol of control and oppression. This ambiguity kept the idea alive, able to resurface whenever economic crises, social insecurity, or identity tensions created fertile ground for narratives that promised belonging in exchange for obedience. She knew that the danger lay not only in the past, but in the ability of this vision to reinvent itself under new masks. She knew that Aryan socialism carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The very system that promised absolute order and unbreakable belonging required constant pressure on all its members, and the systematic elimination of any element deemed impure. This logic not only drained the economy and exhausted human resources in wars and persecutions, but also destroyed spontaneous trust between people, replacing it with surveillance and suspicion. In the end, the military collapse of 1945 was only the visible consequence. The moral and social bankruptcy had already happened earlier. The human cost was devastating. Millions of lives were sacrificed in the name of a purity that never truly existed. Families were torn apart, entire communities disappeared, and the very idea of solidarity was twisted into an instrument of control. She understood that, for those who lived inside this structure, the sense of belonging that once united them turned into enforced silence and collective shame after defeat. And yet, the legacy persists. Not as a dominant ideology, but as fragments that still circulate in political speeches, in the aesthetics of extremist movements, and in rhetoric of exclusion disguised as cultural defense. In times of crisis, these echoes grow louder, seducing with promises of unity, security, and identity. The same promises that, in the past, led to one of the greatest tragedies in history. She realized that understanding this past was not merely a matter of memory, but a way of recognizing how it hides in the shadows of the present. She recalled the silence at the beginning, that space where no one dared to speak openly about Aryan socialism. Now, after dissecting its essence, she understood that this silence was not only fear, it was also the difficulty of confronting how deeply this ideology had exploited something profoundly human: the desire to belong, to have identity, to be part of a greater purpose. Hitler had turned that impulse into a political instrument, creating a cohesive community built on exclusion, surveillance, and violence. Psychologically, what made this doctrine so dangerous was precisely its ability to present itself as protective. For those inside, it offered security, recognition, and pride. For those outside, it imposed marginalization or death. Socially and culturally, its legacy survives as both a warning and a latent threat. Whenever insecurity, economic crisis, or fear of the other grows strong, the same arguments can reappear, adapted to new times and languages. She knew that understanding Aryan socialism was more than revisiting a dark chapter of history. It was understanding how ideas like this can be reborn. Because, in the end, it is not weapons or laws that sustain such regimes, but the transformation of a legitimate feeling of belonging into a tool of domination. And that transformation, if not recognized, can happen again, silently, gradually, and almost imperceptibly. What remained at the end of this narrative was the awareness that the danger is not only in the past, but in what the past is still able to teach and to hide. As she closes, she makes it clear. Understanding Aryan socialism means understanding how ideologies shape entire societies and how they can return in disguise. If you want to fully grasp the context of that era, subscribe to the channel now. This is where history is told with depth and without distortion. And don't stop here. Watch the video on your screen to dive even deeper into the events that shaped that time.